The autumn sun filtered weakly through the pale curtains of a modest suburban house, its light soft but incapable of warming the silence that had taken root there. Emily sat by the kitchen window, hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, staring blankly into the yard where leaves drifted lazily to the ground. She was 32, slender with chestnut brown hair that fell carelessly over her shoulders, her face pale and marked with fatigue. Her hazel eyes once held a brightness, but now carried the weight of 1,000 unshed tears. Just 3 months earlier, her husband, Daniel, had died in a tragic car accident on a rainy night, leaving her with their 7-year-old daughter, Sophie, and a hollow ache that seemed endless. Daniel had been a kind-hearted man, tall and broad-shouldered with a gentle smile that reassured everyone who met him. He had been a construction engineer, admired for his dedication and generosity, but his life was cut short when his car skidded off a wet highway. The suddenness of it had broken something deep inside Emily, and she often felt she was floating through her days in a fog, unable to piece her life back together. Sophie, meanwhile, was a mirror of Daniel in her spirited nature. She had wavy dark hair that framed her heart-shaped face, and eyes so bright and curious that they could melt even the heaviest heart. Yet those eyes had dimmed since the accident. Sophie was still a child, but grief had made her quieter, more hesitant. She no longer laughed freely at cartoons or chased butterflies in the yard. Instead, she clung to her mother, watching her with a worried expression no child her age should ever wear. Despite her sadness, she carried a resilience that seemed far older than her years. Margaret, Emily's mother, had moved in shortly after Daniel's funeral. At 60, Margaret was a sturdy woman with silver-streaked hair always tied in a neat bun, her blue eyes sharp but full of compassion. Life had made her practical and strong, as she had raised Emily and her siblings alone after her husband passed away decades ago. Margaret carried herself with quiet authority, always in simple dresses with an apron tied firmly at her waist, her hands never still as she cooked, cleaned, or folded laundry. She understood grief intimately, yet she knew the only way forward was to keep moving, to anchor Emily and Sophie when they were at risk of being swept away by despair. Olivia, Emily's younger cousin, visited nearly every day. At 26, Olivia was tall and slim with auburn hair that fell in soft waves and freckles dusting her fair cheeks. She had a warm, gentle nature, and her laughter carried an ease that made children trust her instantly. Olivia was an elementary school teacher, and her natural patience, along with her nurturing spirit, made her a source of comfort for Sophie. She would often kneel down to Sophie's level, speaking softly to her, drawing silly faces on napkins, or playing gentle games of make-believe that coaxed small smiles from the girl. For Olivia, family had always come first, and though she lived in a small apartment across town, she spent most of her free time in Emily's home, believing Sophie needed her as much as Emily did. On one particular afternoon, Emily found herself overwhelmed by the mundane task of sorting Daniel's belongings. His coat still hung neatly by the door, his tools carefully organized in the garage, his cologne lingering faintly in the bedroom. Every object was a reminder of the life they had shared, and the pain was too raw. She collapsed onto the bed, clutching Daniel's old sweatshirt, inhaling its fading scent as tears streamed down her face. She whispered his name again and again as if it might bring him back. Sophie peeked timidly from the doorway, her small hands twisting the hem of her dress. "Mommy?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Emily quickly wiped her tears, forcing a weak smile. "It's okay, sweetheart. Mommy's just tired." But Sophie wasn't convinced. She crawled onto the bed, curling against her mother's side, her little arms wrapping around Emily as if she was the one offering protection. In that moment, Emily felt both crushed and uplifted, the weight of being needed so deeply, yet also the light of Sophie's love, reminding her she still had a reason to keep going. Margaret entered quietly, placing a tray with tea and warm bread on the nightstand. She didn't speak, only rested a firm hand on Emily's shoulder before leaving the room. Her silent support was her way of saying, "You're not alone. I am here, and I will hold this family together when you cannot." That evening, Olivia stopped by with a coloring book and a set of bright markers for Sophie. She crouched down on the living room rug, spreading the pages out. "Let's color the butterflies," Olivia suggested cheerfully, her green eyes sparkling. Sophie hesitated, then slowly began to choose colors, her small hands guided by Olivia's patience. Emily watched from the sofa, her chest tightening with both gratitude and shame. Gratitude that Olivia could bring joy to Sophie's heart, and shame that she herself could not. She felt like a ghost drifting through her own home, while Olivia, with her warmth and ease, filled the gap she could not manage. A gentle drizzle tapped against the window panes on a gray spring morning, the kind that blurred the edges of the neighborhood and cloaked everything in a quiet stillness. Emily stood before the mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the collar of her pale blue dress with trembling fingers. It had been nearly a year since Daniel's death, and for the first time there was a flicker of warmth in her chest that was not grief, but something more uncertain. Hope. That hope had a name. Grace. Grace Mitchell had entered Emily's life in the most unexpected way. They met at a charity gala for widows and families who had lost loved ones in accidents. Grace was 34, tall and statuesque, with waves of jet black hair that shimmered under the lights. Her skin was fair with a porcelain-like smoothness, her eyes a striking emerald green that seemed to read emotions hidden beneath the surface. She carried herself with elegance, dressed in tailored suits or sleek dresses that accentuated her graceful posture. Grace was a corporate lawyer, successful and respected, known for her eloquence in court and her meticulous attention to detail. Yet beneath her polished exterior, she had a charm that disarmed people quickly. Her laughter was warm, her gestures thoughtful, and she always remembered the smallest details about those she met. When Emily first spoke to her, she felt an almost magnetic pull. Grace had listened with genuine interest, holding her gaze steadily, nodding in empathy as Emily spoke about Daniel and Sophie. For months afterward, Grace appeared like a guardian angel in their lives. She visited often, bringing Sophie little gifts, a set of watercolor paints, a soft pink scarf, or books filled with fairy tales. She volunteered to help Emily with errands, always arriving with a bottle of wine or a basket of fresh fruit, her presence turning the lonely house into something vibrant. To Sophie, she seemed gentle, often kneeling to her level to ask about school or admiring her drawings with exaggerated delight. Sophie, though shy at first, began to smile more when Grace was around, though her trust remained tentative. Margaret, however, watched more cautiously. At 60, her instincts were sharp, her life tempered by hardship. She noticed the way Grace's green eyes lingered just a fraction too long on Sophie, as though measuring her. She observed how Grace, in conversations, sometimes guided Emily subtly away from parenting decisions, replacing them with her own suggestions. Margaret did not voice these suspicions immediately. She merely observed, storing away each small detail as one collects pieces of a puzzle. The day Emily introduced Grace formally as her partner was bright and full of birdsong, a contrast to the heaviness in Margaret's heart. They had gathered for dinner at the old oak table in the dining room. Grace wore a cream-colored blouse, her hair shining as she greeted Margaret with a poised handshake and Sophie with a kiss on the forehead. Emily's cheeks glowed with a happiness Margaret had not seen in months. "I want you all to know," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly, "Grace has been a light in my life, I know Daniel will always be in my heart, but I also know he would want me to be happy again. Grace makes me feel alive." Sophie sat quietly beside Olivia, her small hand tucked into her cousin's, as if seeking reassurance. Olivia smiled softly, but her green eyes flickered with unease. She wanted to be happy for Emily, but something about Grace's perfect composure unsettled her. Olivia, with her intuitive heart, trusted the natural bonds of love and patience, and Grace's flawless demeanor felt almost too practiced. Over the following weeks, Grace's presence in the house became constant. She decorated Sophie's room with expensive curtains and toys, replaced old furniture with sleek modern designs, and introduced gourmet meals that felt foreign on their rustic table. Emily was dazzled, swept up by Grace's worldliness and efficiency. Grace spoke of vacations to Europe, private schools for Sophie, and a future filled with security. Yet Sophie grew quieter. Though Grace never raised her voice, she often corrected Sophie with an icy politeness, reminding her to sit straighter or use her fork properly. To others, it might have seemed like refined manners, but to Margaret, the chill in Grace's tone was unmistakable. One evening, while Emily was in the kitchen preparing dessert, Margaret entered the living room to find Sophie sitting on the floor, clutching her worn teddy bear. Grace stood above her, lips curved into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You're too old for that bear," Grace said smoothly, reaching down to pluck it from Sophie's hands. "We'll get rid of it tomorrow. You don't want to seem like a baby, do you?" Sophie's lower lip trembled as she whispered, "It was Daddy's gift." For the briefest moment, Margaret saw something hard flash in Grace's emerald eyes before she returned the bear with a practiced laugh. "Oh, darling, I didn't mean it. Of course you can keep it." But the damage was done. Sophie clutched the bear tighter, her small shoulders tense, and Margaret's unease deepened. That night, Margaret confronted Emily gently, her voice careful. "Are you certain about Grace, dear? Sophie seems unsettled." Emily bristled, her hazel eyes filling with both defensiveness and fear. "Mom, Grace is wonderful. She's given us so much. She cares about Sophie. She's just trying to help. Please don't ruin this for me." Margaret said nothing more, but her heart ached. She recognized the vulnerability in Emily's eyes, the desperate need to believe she had found happiness again. Margaret resolved to stay silent, but her watchfulness sharpened. Later that week, Olivia arrived to take Sophie to the park. As she fastened Sophie's jacket, she whispered, "You okay, sweetheart?" Sophie nodded, but her eyes flickered toward the kitchen where Grace stood chatting brightly with Emily. Olivia followed her gaze, and though she smiled reassuringly at Sophie, her stomach twisted. She had seen too many children put on brave faces in her classroom. She recognized the signs of a child retreating inward, even if no one else wanted to admit it. And though she said nothing aloud, Olivia made herself a silent promise. If Grace ever hurts Sophie, she will answer to me. For Emily, life seemed to be opening again like a spring flower after a harsh winter. For Margaret and Olivia, however, shadows had begun to stretch across the walls of that fragile home, and they feared Emily was too blinded by her longing for love to see them. The late afternoon sun cast a golden haze across the small suburban neighborhood, yet inside Emily's home, the warmth of the light did little to soften the tension quietly brewing within its walls. Emily, still glowing faintly with the fragile hope of her new marriage, moved through the house with the same rhythm she had always kept. Gentle steps, careful attention to detail, and a tendency to fill silences with soothing words. But beneath the surface of her joy, subtle fractures had begun to form, ones she did not yet see, though others around her sensed the tremors. Grace was the kind of woman whose beauty arrived with the impact of a sudden storm. Dark hair cascading in waves down her shoulders, deep brown eyes sharpened by determination, and a figure both elegant and commanding. She had the ability to light up a room when she chose, offering smiles that seemed sincere, her voice smooth as silk. But there were moments, fleeting and almost imperceptible, when her mask slipped. The softness in her gaze hardened into steel, her smile stiffened into a sneer, and her words carried a sting that only Sophie truly understood. Sophie, now 7 years old, was a delicate child with chestnut hair that curled at the ends and eyes the color of warm honey. She had inherited her late father's quiet demeanor, preferring the company of books and soft toys to noisy games. Her shyness made her vulnerable, and though she longed for affection, she recoiled whenever Grace's presence drew too close. At first, Sophie had tried to please her stepmother, helping with small chores, complimenting her dresses, drawing little pictures, and leaving them on Grace's nightstand. But the gestures were often met with cold indifference, or worse, criticism thinly veiled as guidance. "Don't you ever color inside the lines?" Grace would mutter, her lips curling in disdain before smoothing into a smile when Emily entered the room. Olivia, Emily's cousin, continued to be a frequent presence in the house. A woman in her early 30s, she had a warm face framed by sandy blonde hair and a naturally protective nature that drew children to her. She had been Sophie's safe harbor long before Grace arrived, and now, more than ever, Sophie clung to her with desperate affection. Olivia was the first to notice the shadows in Sophie's eyes, the stiffness in her posture whenever Grace walked into the room. It was in small things, how Sophie's fingers trembled slightly when she set the dinner table if Grace was watching, or how her laughter vanished the moment Grace's heels clicked on the floorboards. Margaret, Emily's mother, was not blind to these changes either. Though in her 60s, she carried herself with a resilience born from years of hardship, her silver gray hair tied back neatly, her blue eyes sharp and observant. She had once welcomed Grace with open arms, believing her to be the answer to Emily's prayers. But Margaret now caught the fleeting looks Grace cast toward Sophie, eyes narrowed not with maternal affection, but with irritation, sometimes even something darker. The turning point came one rainy evening when Sophie, curled up on the living room couch with a book, accidentally knocked over a glass of water onto the rug. Her little hands scrambled to clean it, panic rising in her chest. Grace, who had been scrolling through her phone, snapped her head up and in a voice colder than the storm outside hissed, "Can't you do anything right?" Sophie froze, her eyes welling with tears. But just as quickly as the venom appeared, Grace's tone softened as Emily entered. "Oh, sweetheart," she said sweetly, kneeling to dab the rug, "you must be more careful next time." Emily, oblivious, kissed Sophie's head and praised Grace for being so understanding. Olivia, however, had seen it all. The cruel flash in Grace's expression haunted her that night, and she lay awake wondering how she could protect Sophie without creating rifts in the family. For Sophie, the incident cemented the growing fear that she could not tell her mother the truth. Emily seemed so happy, so convinced she had found stability again, and Sophie, young though she was, carried the heavy burden of not wanting to shatter her mother's fragile peace. Days stretched into weeks, each filled with tiny acts of cruelty hidden behind closed doors. Grace's corrections turned into scoldings, her neglect into deliberate exclusion. She would make Sophie sit alone at the table with the food she disliked, or criticize her drawings and homework with sharp words disguised as encouragement. "Maybe if you tried harder, someone would be proud of you," Grace whispered once, the words slicing through Sophie's tender heart. Emily, meanwhile, saw only the version of Grace that wanted to be seen: a devoted wife, a helpful partner, a woman committed to building a family. Whenever Margaret or Olivia hinted at concerns, Emily dismissed them gently, saying they must have misunderstood. Grace loved Sophie, she insisted, She just has a different way of showing it. But Margaret's instincts told her otherwise. She had weathered enough storms in her life to recognize the quiet, insidious kind of danger that slipped past smiles and honeyed words. She resolved to keep a closer watch, even if it meant risking tension with her daughter. Olivia, meanwhile, began to spend even more time with Sophie, taking her for walks, helping with homework, or simply sitting beside her while she read. Sophie rarely spoke of her fears, but her silence spoke volumes, and Olivia's heart ached with the weight of secrets she could not yet prove. The fractures in the family's foundation were no longer invisible. Though Emily clung desperately to the vision of happiness she thought she had found, Margaret and Olivia knew the truth. Behind Grace's perfect smile, something darker was waiting, growing bolder by the day. The wind howled against the windows, rattling the panes, as if the night itself wanted to pry into the secrets of the house. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace did little to ease the chill that lingered in Olivia's chest. She sat quietly in the armchair, Sophie nestled against her side, the child's small frame trembling with exhaustion and fear. Olivia stroked Sophie's hair, her mind running through the silent battles she now fought daily on the girl's behalf. Battles Emily seemed unable or unwilling to see. Olivia had always been protective by nature, her sandy blonde hair often tucked loosely behind her ears, her hazel eyes carrying both kindness and quiet determination. She had grown up watching her own mother endure a cold marriage, which left her wary of people who wore masks of charm to hide their true intentions. That wariness sharpened into resolve now, as she watched Grace slowly strangle the joy out of Sophie's young life. Grace's cruelty had become more insidious, no longer confined to cutting words, but manifesting in acts of exclusion and deliberate neglect. At dinner, she would serve Sophie portions smaller than everyone else's, or roll her eyes when the girl asked a timid question. When Emily was present, Grace transformed into a picture of patience, offering Sophie a smile and a soft correction, as if she were the most understanding stepmother in the world. The duplicity gnawed at Olivia. Emily, blinded by her longing for stability and love, remained deaf to Margaret's warnings. "You don't see the way she looks at Sophie," Margaret insisted one afternoon, her voice tense with suppressed fear. Margaret's silver hair glistened under the kitchen light, her hands tightening on her teacup as she spoke. "It's not love, Emily. It's resentment. Something darker. Can't you feel it?" Emily shook her head, her gentle features shadowed with fatigue, but steadfast in her belief. "You're wrong, Mom. Grace has been nothing but good to us. She wants what's best for Sophie." Margaret swallowed her protest, though her blue eyes betrayed her unease. She had lived long enough to trust her instincts, and they screamed that Grace's intentions were far from pure. Sophie, meanwhile, grew quieter each day, her once bright laughter now a rare gift. She kept her fears locked inside, too young to understand how dangerous silence could be, too afraid to break her mother's fragile happiness. Olivia began to take on the role Sophie desperately needed, a shield. When Grace's voice sharpened, Olivia was there to intercept, making excuses for the child, or even taking blame herself. When Sophie's tears brimmed after another cutting remark, Olivia distracted her with stories or small adventures to the park. She became Sophie's safe place, but with that came a heavy burden. Grace noticed. Her dark eyes, once filled with feigned warmth, now glinted with suspicion whenever she caught Olivia holding Sophie's hand a little too tightly, or when Sophie smiled more brightly in Olivia's presence than her own. One night, as Emily prepared for bed, Grace lingered in the doorway of Sophie's room, watching the child sleep. Her lips curled into a thin smile that never reached her eyes. Sophie represented everything that tethered Emily's loyalty away from her: innocence, love, legacy. And more dangerously, Sophie was a barrier to what Grace secretly craved: control of Emily's modest but valuable inheritance. Grace had always been ambitious, driven not only by charm, but by hunger for security and power. Born into a fractured family where money was scarce and affection scarcer, she had vowed never to live dependent on anyone else's mercy. To her, Sophie was not a child, but an obstacle, one that kept her from fully claiming what she believed should be hers. In her moments alone, Grace's thoughts turned sharp and calculating. If Sophie were no longer part of the equation, Emily's world and everything she owned would rest entirely in her hands. She began to plant seeds, small and subtle, twisting conversations so that Emily might one day question Sophie's behavior. "She's very sensitive," Grace would sigh, brushing Sophie's timidness off as a weakness. "I worry she might not cope well in the real world." Emily, though not cruel, began to waver slightly, her need to keep peace in the household blinding her to the undercurrent of manipulation. Olivia, however, saw the threads being woven. Her hazel eyes caught the smug flickers in Grace's smile, the lingering glances at Sophie that were anything but maternal. She began journaling what she observed, a silent record of Grace's words and actions, hoping that someday it might help prove the truth. Yet fear gnawed at her. Would Emily believe her if the time came? Margaret remained resolute, refusing to let her granddaughter slip into the shadows of fear without a fight. "You must stay close to Sophie," she urged Olivia, her tone firm. "Grace won't stop until she gets what she wants, and I'm afraid that means taking Sophie out of the way." Olivia nodded, her chest tight with dread. She knew Margaret was right. The house had become a battlefield, one fought with glances, with whispers, with small cruelties that built like pressure behind closed doors. Emily, blind to the war, lived in her fragile happiness, unaware that Grace's ambition had already marked Sophie as its first casualty. The evening sky glowed with streaks of crimson and gold as lanterns were lit along the backyard of Margaret's home, their soft light spilling warmth across rows of decorated tables. The occasion was meant to be joyous, a grand anniversary celebration where family, friends, and neighbors gathered to honor Margaret and her late husband's enduring legacy. The garden, alive with music and laughter, brimmed with a sense of community that Emily had longed to feel again. She stood radiant in a pale blue dress, her auburn hair pinned neatly, her green eyes bright with gratitude. For her, this night was more than a party. It was a chance to prove that her fractured family could stand strong again. Grace played her role flawlessly at first. Dressed in an emerald gown that accentuated her tall frame and dark hair, she floated among the guests with effortless charm. Her deep brown eyes sparkled under the lights, her laughter rich and inviting. She spoke to the neighbors with grace, complimented Margaret's friends, and even placed an occasional arm around Emily, as though to remind the world they were united. To onlookers, she seemed the perfect wife, devoted stepmother, and gracious hostess. Sophie, in contrast, moved quietly through the crowd in her cream-colored dress with a bow tied neatly at the back. At just 7 years old, she carried herself with a timid grace, her chestnut curls bouncing as she clung to Olivia's hand. Her honey-colored eyes darted nervously whenever Grace glanced her way, but she managed faint smiles when Olivia knelt to whisper reassurances. Olivia, always protective, wore a burgundy dress, her sandy blonde hair braided loosely down her back, and her hazel eyes never strayed far from Sophie. Margaret, meanwhile, stood like a quiet sentinel near the porch, her silver-gray hair tucked elegantly, her blue eyes sharp as ever, scanning Grace with a suspicion honed by months of silent observation. The night unfolded beautifully at first. Music played, glasses clinked, and guests exchanged warm stories about the family. Emily felt a swell of pride as she looked around, believing perhaps her mother and cousin had been too harsh in their judgments of Grace. But beneath Grace's poised exterior, impatience gnawed. The laughter, the affection showered on Sophie by others, all struck her like tiny needles. To Grace, Sophie was not a child, but a chain dragging her dreams down. As the night wore on and attention turned toward Margaret for a toast, Grace seized her moment. With a calculated smile, she clinked her glass for silence. "I just want to say how grateful I am," she began, her voice sweet, drawing every eye toward her. "Being welcomed into this family has been a blessing. But I think we must also speak honestly about challenges." The crowd, confused but polite, listened. Grace's gaze shifted deliberately to Sophie, and her words sharpened like knives. "Raising someone else's child is difficult, especially a child who has been nothing but a burden. Sophie doesn't belong here, not truly. She holds Emily back, keeps her from moving on, from building the life we deserve." The garden fell into stunned silence. Sophie's small body stiffened, her eyes brimming with tears as whispers rippled through the guests. Olivia gasped, kneeling to clutch Sophie's hand, her hazel eyes blazing with outrage. Emily, pale and trembling, struggled to comprehend what she had just heard. Her heart raced, her breath caught in her throat. Grace, however, stood taller, her smile unfaltering, as though her cruelty were truth dressed as courage. It was Margaret who broke the silence. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped forward, her voice clear and unyielding. "Enough." All eyes turned to her. She held a small folder in her hands, her fingers steady despite the weight of what she carried. "I've kept quiet long enough. Tonight, you reveal yourself, Grace, but I've seen you long before this moment." The tension thickened as Margaret opened the folder. She pulled out letters, documents, and even a small digital recorder. Her sharp blue eyes locked onto Grace. "You thought your whispers went unheard. You thought your cruelty to Sophie would remain hidden behind closed doors. But I have the evidence. The words you spoke when you thought no one listened, the bruises of your neglect, the notes you left carelessly that reveal your true intent." Murmurs surged among the guests as Margaret held up one letter where Grace had scribbled calculations about Emily's inheritance, alongside cruel notes about Sophie being an obstacle. Olivia stepped closer, her face fierce with vindication. "I heard it too," she said firmly. "The threats, the belittling. Sophie was never safe with you, Grace." Grace's mask cracked at last. Her dark eyes narrowed, lips pressed tight, her posture stiffened as though cornered. Emily's world tilted violently. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she stared at the woman she thought she loved, her mind screaming with betrayal. She wanted to deny it, to cling to the image of happiness Grace had painted, but the proof lay before her, undeniable. Sophie sobbed quietly into Olivia's arms, and Margaret's voice rang out once more, steady and unflinching. "You wanted everything, Grace. The money, the control, the freedom from a child's needs. But you forget one thing. Family isn't an obstacle, and you will not destroy mine." The once festive garden was now heavy with silence, broken only by Sophie's soft cries and the murmurs of horrified guests. Grace, stripped of her veneer, stood exposed before them all, her ambition and cruelty no longer hidden in the shadows. The rain had begun to fall lightly over the small town, a fine mist veiling the quiet streets, turning the garden lanterns into blurred halos of light. Inside Margaret's home, the aftermath of the disastrous anniversary celebration still lingered like the bitter taste of smoke after a fire. The table stood abandoned, half-empty glasses left behind, bouquets drooping under the weight of the drizzle. The music had stopped hours ago, yet the silence that replaced it carried a heavier melody, one of shame, heartbreak, and broken illusions. Emily sat slumped in the parlor, her pale blue dress wrinkled, her auburn hair undone, the curls clinging damply to her cheeks where tears had traced endless paths. Her green eyes, once so vibrant, were hollow now, consumed by guilt. She replayed the night again and again in her mind. Grace's cruel words, Margaret's revelations, the horrified faces of friends, and each time her heart clenched tighter. She had invited a wolf into their home, trusted her, loved her, and in doing so, she had exposed Sophie, her innocent daughter, to suffering she should have shielded her from. Margaret moved quietly about the room, gathering the discarded remnants of the celebration. Her silver gray hair was tied back loosely now, her usually sharp posture softened by fatigue, yet her blue eyes still burned with the strength of conviction. Though she had exposed Grace, the triumph felt hollow when she saw her daughter so broken. She placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder, firm yet tender. "You didn't fail forever, Emily," she whispered. "You only failed for a time, but you have the chance to do better now, to protect Sophie as she deserves." Emily swallowed hard, but words failed her. The shame was a weight pressing her chest. How could she forgive herself when her little girl had suffered under her watch? In the corner, Olivia sat cross-legged on the rug with Sophie curled against her chest. Olivia's sandy blonde hair was loosened from its braid, strands falling over her flushed face as she rocked the child gently. Her hazel eyes brimmed with both fury and tenderness, the dual fire of a protector who had endured too much. Sophie clung to her, trembling, her small frame shaking as sobs broke from her lips. The girl's honey-colored eyes, wide and red from crying, searched Olivia's face with desperate need. Then, with a voice raw and cracked from tears, Sophie whispered a single word that pierced through the heavy silence. "Mommy." It was not Emily's name she called, but Olivia's. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap, echoing off the walls of Margaret's parlor. Olivia froze, her breath caught in her throat, her arms instinctively tightening around Sophie. For a fleeting moment, her heart swelled with an indescribable warmth, but guilt quickly shadowed it. She glanced at Emily, terrified of the wound those words might inflict. Emily's eyes, glassy with tears, met Olivia's. Pain sliced through her heart, sharper than anything Grace had ever said. To lose her daughter's trust, to lose even her name, felt like losing a piece of her soul. Yet, beneath the anguish, Emily saw the truth. Olivia had been there when she had not. Olivia had been the one Sophie turned to in fear, in need, in love. Margaret, ever perceptive, stepped closer, her voice low but steady, like the anchor of the room. "A child knows where she is safe," she said softly. "Don't be angry at her for that, Emily. Be angry at the woman who put her in danger." Sophie whimpered again and buried her face into Olivia's neck, repeating the word through her sobs. "Mommy, Mommy." Olivia's arms trembled as she held her tighter, torn between the fierce protectiveness she felt and the guilt of overshadowing Emily. Emily rose shakily from her chair, her knees weak, her body heavy as though carrying the weight of years. She approached them slowly, each step echoing the war inside her. She reached out, her fingers brushing Sophie's back, but the child flinched and clung tighter to Olivia. That rejection broke Emily's heart into shards. Tears spilled freely, and she knelt down beside them, no longer holding pride, no longer hiding behind denial. "Sophie," she whispered, her voice cracking, "I'm so sorry. I should have been there. I should have protected you. I don't deserve you calling me Mommy right now, but I swear to you I will never let anyone hurt you again." Olivia's hazel eyes glistened with tears as she looked at Emily, the pain of the moment binding them together. She gently stroked Sophie's hair, whispering soothing words, but her gaze held Emily's, silently acknowledging the gravity of what had just been spoken. Margaret stood behind them, her figure silhouetted against the dim light of the room, her heart aching at the sight of her daughter's brokenness, but also swelling with pride that Emily was finally seeing clearly. The night closed in around them, the sound of the rain tapping gently against the windows, as though marking the end of an old chapter. Grace was gone, dragged away in humiliation, her plans exposed, but her shadow lingered, leaving scars that would take time to heal. Emily, Margaret, Olivia, and Sophie sat together in that fragile silence, a family bruised but not broken. And though Sophie clung to Olivia's neck, refusing to let go, Emily's whispered promise was the first fragile step toward mending what Grace had tried so hard to destroy. The morning sky was painted in soft hues of pink and gold, the quiet after days of storms both within the family and in the weather itself. Emily stood by the window, her reflection pale and tired, but her eyes filled with a fragile determination. For the first time in years, she no longer felt trapped in Grace's shadow, nor blinded by the illusion of a perfect marriage. Instead, she felt the weight of responsibility, of rebuilding not only her family, but also herself. She looked at Sophie, still asleep in the next room, her small chest rising and falling in rhythm, innocence bruised but not broken. Olivia had stayed overnight, refusing to leave Sophie's side. Emily thought back to the night before, when Sophie had clung to Olivia with trembling arms and called her mommy for the first time. That single word had shattered Emily's heart, filling it with both guilt and relief. She could not deny the truth anymore. Olivia had been more of a mother to Sophie than she had allowed herself to be. Margaret arrived early, carrying with her the steady grace of a woman seasoned by life's trials. Margaret was in her late 60s, with silver hair always pulled neatly into a bun, a posture upright as though she bore the invisible armor of wisdom. Her eyes, however, softened whenever they landed on Sophie, who represented both vulnerability and resilience. She walked into the living room where Emily sat, still holding a cup of untouched tea. "The past doesn't have to define the future, Emily," Margaret said gently, setting down a folder of documents she had been organizing. "You can start again. Sophie needs that from you. And Olivia, she's given more of herself than you've ever asked." Emily lowered her gaze, shame creeping across her features. She thought of Grace's venomous words, of the way she had turned a blind eye when Sophie cried out silently for help. How had she been so blind? Her fingers tightened around the cup, the heat almost burning her skin, but she welcomed the sting. It felt like penance. Sophie woke later, her eyes swollen from tears, yet glowing faintly when she saw Olivia by her side. Olivia, a woman in her mid-30s, carried herself with quiet strength. Her chestnut brown hair, often tied back for practicality, framed her angular but gentle face. She had the air of someone who had weathered hardships, and indeed, her life had been marked by loss. Having grown up in a fractured family, she knew too well what abandonment felt like. That was why she had instinctively shielded Sophie, even when it meant clashing with Emily. Olivia helped Sophie dress, brushing her hair with delicate strokes, whispering encouragements. She treated the girl not as a duty, but as a treasure. Emily watched them from the doorway, torn between jealousy and admiration. She envied the bond, but she also knew Sophie's laughter and Olivia's presence was proof that the child had found the safety she desperately needed. Later, the tomorrow afternoon, the three women sat together in the garden. The air carried the scent of damp earth and blooming roses. Sophie sat between Olivia and Emily, holding both their hands, her small frame finally at peace. Emily turned to Olivia, her voice trembling. "I failed her," she confessed. "I let Grace poison my judgment, but I can't undo the past. I don't know if Sophie will ever forgive me. Olivia looked at her steadily, her hazel eyes calm. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about proving every day that you'll be better from now on. Sophie doesn't need perfection, Emily. She needs honesty and love. Margaret nodded approvingly, adding, "And you are not alone. Family isn't only bound by blood, it's made by the choices we stand by." In that moment, the walls that had divided them seemed to crumble. Emily reached out, covering Olivia's hand, a silent plea for strength and unity. Sophie's fingers tightened around theirs, as though sealing the bond. By evening, the household had taken on a lighter atmosphere. Sophie laughed again, tentative but genuine, when Olivia baked cookies and let her decorate them with too much frosting. Emily joined, awkward at first, but the sound of her daughter's laughter began to heal the rawness in her heart. Margaret watched quietly, her lips curving into a satisfied smile. She had feared for this family, but now she saw a fragile new foundation being laid. When night fell, the three of them sat together by the fireplace, Sophie curled in Olivia's lap, Emily close beside them. The flickering glow painted their faces in warmth, and for the first time in a long while, Emily felt the stirrings of hope. She leaned toward Sophie and whispered, "I'll never let you down again." Sophie stirred sleepily, her voice faint but steady. "Promise?" Emily kissed her forehead. "Promise." And as the fire crackled, Margaret placed her hand over all three of theirs, whispering words that carried the weight of truth. "This is what family looks like.